A humble man in economy. The soft hum of the airplane engines filled the dimly lit cabin as weary passengers shuffled down the narrow aisle. Flight 718 from Los Angeles to New York was a red-eye, and most travelers, burdened with exhaustion, dragged their carry-ons with tired eyes searching for their seats. Among them, unnoticed by most, sat Keanu Reeves, dressed in a simple black hoodie, worn jeans, and a pair of scuffed sneakers. He looked like any other ordinary passenger. His quiet demeanor and lack of ostentation made him blend in effortlessly. He had chosen a window seat -32A, hoping to spend the 6-hour journey in peace, staring out at the vast darkness beyond the tiny oval window. As Keanu settled in, fastening his seatbelt and pulling out a well-worn paperback novel from his bag, he heard a sudden, exaggerated sigh. A sharply dressed man in his late 40s had just stopped beside the seat next to him -32B. His tailored navy blue suit, polished Italian leather shoes, and gleaming Rolex watch screamed wealth. A Bluetooth headset clung to his ear, and he clutched a sleek leather briefcase embossed with a corporate logo. His name, as Keanu would soon learn, was Roger Calloway, a high-powered investment banker from New York. Roger's gaze fell on the economy seat with visible disdain. His lips curled in disgust as he surveyed his assigned spot next to Keanu. His eyes flickered towards the first-class cabin, longing to be anywhere but here. "Are you kidding me?" he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Realizing he had no choice, he heaved an exasperated sigh, shoved his briefcase into the overhead bin, and collapsed into his seat with an audible groan. He barely looked at Keanu before muttering, "Guess not everyone can afford first class." "Huh." Keanu turned slightly, offering a polite smile. "Good evening." Roger scoffed but barely acknowledged him. Instead, he muttered under his breath, "Economy class. Cramped seats, no privacy. And now, I'm stuck here for 6 hours. Great." Keanu remained unbothered. He simply adjusted his seatbelt and returned his gaze to the window. He had heard comments like this before. It didn't bother him. He wasn't here for attention, luxury, or comfort, just a quiet flight. A few minutes later, the final boarding announcement played over the intercom, and flight attendants moved swiftly down the aisles, completing their last safety checks. The pilot's voice crackled over the speakers, informing passengers of the expected flight time and weather conditions. As the plane began to taxi toward the runway, Roger's grumbling only grew louder. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, tugging at his suit jacket as if offended by the very thought of sharing space with regular passengers. Then he turned toward Keanu, and in a loud, almost condescending voice, said, "You know, people always say you should dress for success. But looking at you, I guess that rule doesn't apply to everyone." Keanu turned his head slightly, his expression calm. Comfort over style for long flights. Roger chuckled mockingly. "Sure, buddy. Let me guess, you're an artist? A writer? Or just between jobs?" Keanu let out a soft laugh but chose not to answer. Instead, he focused on his book, flipping through the pages as if Roger's words were no more than background noise. But Roger wasn't done yet. As the plane ascended, cabin lights dimmed slightly, allowing passengers to rest. A quiet lull filled the aircraft, except for Roger, who continued his monologue about the superiority of first-class amenities. "I mean, in first class, you get real food, privacy, and actual legroom. Not like this cattle car." He scoffed. "Have you ever even flown first class?" Keanu closed his book gently and turned his gaze toward Roger, his expression unreadable. "Actually, I have. But sometimes simplicity is nice." Roger let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Simplicity. That's just a fancy word for can't afford it. Come on, man, admit it. If you had the money, you wouldn't be sitting back here." Keanu tilted his head thoughtfully. "Maybe. But money doesn't buy everything." His words were calm, yet they seemed to irritate Roger further. Spoken like someone who's never had it, Roger muttered. Let me tell you something. Money solves a lot of problems. And sitting back here with people who can't even afford a decent pair of shoes isn't my idea of a good time. At that moment, Keanu glanced down at his sneakers, worn but comfortable, and chuckled lightly. They do the job, he said simply. Roger scoffed again and leaned back in his seat, shaking his head in disbelief. Unbelievable. Some people just don't get it. Keanu turned back to his book, unfazed. But Roger had no idea who he was talking to. And soon, he was going to regret it. The weight of wealth and the measure of a man. The airplane soared through the darkened sky, its engines humming softly against the stillness of the cabin. Most passengers had settled into their seats, some dozing off while others scrolled through their phones or flipped through magazines. The occasional clinking of a drink cart and the murmured voices of the flight attendants were the only sounds cutting through the quiet. Keanu Reeves remained composed, his fingers lightly holding the pages of his book, his gaze flickering between the words and the window. Outside, the stars twinkled against the vast darkness. It was a view he had admired countless times, yet it never ceased to captivate him. Roger, on the other hand, was anything but peaceful. The self-assured businessman adjusted his expensive cufflinks, checked his watch, and let out another loud, exaggerated sigh as if to remind everyone within earshot of his discomfort. Keanu could feel Roger shifting in his seat beside him, but he didn't react. Experience had taught him that people like Roger would always find something to complain about, no matter how privileged they were. Still, the man wasn't done. He let out a short laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. I still can't believe people willingly put themselves through this. He gestured around them, scoffing at the cramped space. 6 hours stuck in these stiff seats. Man, you have no idea how much better first class is. If you could afford it, you'd never fly back here again. Keanu turned a page in his book, the ghost of a smile on his lips. Maybe, or maybe I just don't need all that. Roger smirked. That's what poor people say to make themselves feel better. Keanu finally turned to look at him, his expression unreadable. His eyes, however, held something deeper, something Roger couldn't quite place. Before Keanu could respond, the flight attendant approached with the beverage cart. "Good evening, gentlemen. Would you like something to drink?" she asked, her smile warm and professional. Roger straightened up, flashing a charming smile. "Scotch. Neat. The best you have." The flight attendant nodded and turned to Keanu. "And for you, sir." Keanu gave a polite nod. "Just water, please." Roger chuckled as the attendant poured his drink. "Of course. Let me guess. You don't drink." Keanu simply shook his head. "Not tonight." Roger took a slow sip of his scotch, sighing dramatically as if savoring the finest luxury known to man. "See, this is why I work hard. To enjoy the finer things in life. You wouldn't get it." Keanu merely smiled, his patience unwavering. Then something caught the attention of a passenger a few rows ahead. A young woman, barely in her 20s, stole a glance toward their seats. Her eyes widened slightly before she turned to whisper excitedly to her friend. Keanu noticed but gave no reaction. He was used to it. Roger, however, noticed too. He smirked, assuming the attention was meant for him. He straightened his tie and adjusted his watch, leaning back with an air of confidence. Looks like someone recognizes success when they see it. The young woman hesitated before standing up and slowly making her way toward their row. She approached cautiously, wringing her hands nervously. "Excuse me," she said in a soft, uncertain voice. Roger flashed a dazzling smile, expecting admiration, but she barely glanced at him. Instead, her gaze was fixed on Keanu. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but are you Keanu Reeves?" Roger's smile faltered instantly. Keanu, still as humble as ever, chuckled lightly. "That's me." The girl let out a small, excited breath. "Oh my God. I just wanted to say thank you. You have no idea how much your movies have meant to me. You're amazing." Keanu's expression softened, his warmth genuine. "That's really kind of you to say. Thank you. Would it be okay if I got a quick picture?" she asked hesitantly. Keanu nodded. "Of course." She eagerly pulled out her phone as Keanu leaned in for a quick selfie. As she snapped the photo, Roger sat frozen, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. The girl grinned. "Thank you so much. You have no idea how much this means to me." Keanu smiled. "It was my pleasure. Have a great flight." She beamed and quickly walked back to her seat, still buzzing with excitement. Roger, now red-faced, turned to Keanu, his voice suddenly quieter. "Wait a minute. You're Keanu Reeves." Keanu gave a small shrug. "Last time I checked." Roger blinked several times, the realization dawning on him like a slap to the face. His mind raced through everything he had just said. The arrogant comments, the condescending remarks. He had just spent the last hour mocking one of the most beloved and successful actors in the world. His throat went dry. I didn't recognize you." Keanu's lips twitched in amusement. That much was obvious. Roger swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how foolish he must have sounded. He cleared his throat, fumbling for words. I didn't mean." Keanu held up a hand, cutting him off gently. "Don't worry about it." Roger shifted in his seat, now feeling more cramped than ever, not because of the space, but because of his own embarrassment. Keanu turned back to his book, as calm and unbothered as ever. The irony was not lost on Roger. Here he was, a man who prided himself on knowing everything about wealth, status, and success. Yet he had just insulted someone who had all of those things, but chose humility over arrogance. For the first time in years, Roger felt small. He stared at his half-finished glass of scotch, suddenly losing his taste for it. A heavy silence hung between them. And for the first time that night, Roger had nothing to say. A lesson in humility. Roger sat stiffly in his seat, swirling what remained of his scotch in the crystal-clear plastic cup. The ice clinked against the sides, a quiet, almost mocking sound in the silence between him and Keanu. His mind replayed the past hour like a cruel highlight reel. His arrogant remarks, his sneers, his dismissal of the quiet man beside him. He had spoken with the smug confidence of someone who believed he understood success, yet he had unwittingly belittled someone who had achieved more than he ever could. Keanu Reeves, a name that carried more weight than Roger's entire net worth. The realization was like a heavy stone sinking in his gut. Roger prided himself on always being the smartest man in the room. He had spent his life climbing the corporate ladder, making all the right choices, measuring success in dollars, luxury, and social status. He surrounded himself with wealth, power, and people who validated his belief that he was superior. But now, sitting next to one of the most respected actors in Hollywood, he had never felt more foolish. Keanu, for his part, hadn't changed. He continued reading his book, exuding the same quiet calmness he had maintained since the moment he took his seat. He wasn't gloating, he wasn't rubbing it in. He simply was. And that made it even worse. Roger cleared his throat, struggling to find words. "So, I didn't recognize you." Keanu glanced up from his book, offering a polite smile. That much was obvious. Roger gave an awkward chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, listen, about what I said earlier." Keanu waved a hand dismissively. "Don't worry about it." But that only made Roger feel worse. He had spent years in boardrooms, negotiating million-dollar deals, crushing rivals, and bending people to his will. He was used to winning. And yet Keanu wasn't playing that game. He wasn't rubbing Roger's mistakes in his face. He wasn't waiting for an apology. Because he didn't need one. That was the most infuriating part. Roger had spent the entire flight looking down on Keanu, convinced he was superior because he wore a tailored suit and a Rolex. And now he was sitting next to a man who had every reason to flaunt his success. But instead, he chose humility. Roger shifted uncomfortably in his seat. You know, I just assumed you were. He hesitated. Keanu raised an eyebrow, waiting patiently. Roger let out a breath. I assumed you were struggling. Like, I don't know, just some guy who couldn't afford first class. Keanu smiled slightly. And does that change how you would treat someone? Roger blinked, caught off guard by the question. Does it? Of course it did. He treated wealthy people with respect because they had power. He looked down on those without money because, in his mind, they hadn't worked hard enough to deserve better. But now, the man he had belittled wasn't just wealthy. He was richer than Roger could ever dream of being. And yet, Keanu sat beside him in economy class, content, unbothered, and perfectly happy. It didn't make sense. Roger let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. I don't get it, man. You could be up in first class right now, drinking champagne, stretched out in a luxury seat. You've got the money. Keanu nodded. I do. Roger threw up his hands. So, why are you back here? Keanu closed his book gently and set it on his lap. He turned to Roger, his expression thoughtful. Because money doesn't define me. Roger scoffed. Easy to say when you have it. Keanu tilted his head. Is it? Tell me something, Roger. When was the last time you were truly happy? Roger froze. The question caught him completely off guard. Happy? He had wealth, status, power. But was he happy? He tried to answer, but no words came. Keanu continued, his voice calm but firm. You measure success in money, but if it was really the key to happiness, why are so many rich people miserable? Roger swallowed hard. Keanu gestured around them. Look at this flight. Do you think the people in first class are better than the ones in economy? Do you think a bigger seat makes them superior? Roger hesitated, then muttered, That's just how the world works. Keanu shook his head. No, Roger. That's just how you've convinced yourself it works. The words hit Roger harder than he expected. For years, he had lived by a simple belief. Money equals worth. But sitting next to Keanu Reeves, a man who had both wealth and wisdom, Roger was realizing how flawed that belief truly was. The silence stretched between them. Then, Keanu let out a small chuckle. You know, I don't fly economy because I have to. I fly economy because it reminds me of what really matters. The world doesn't revolve around luxury and wealth. It's about the people in it. Their stories, their struggles, their kindness. Roger stared at him, his mind spinning. Keanu smiled. Life isn't measured by how much money you have, Roger. It's measured by how you treat others. Roger let out a long breath, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest, something that felt suspiciously like shame. For years, he had prided himself on knowing everything about success. But tonight, on a simple flight from Los Angeles to New York, Keanu Reeves had just taught him a lesson he would never forget. For the first time, in a long time, Roger felt the weight of his choices, and for the first time in a long time, he wanted to change. The awakening of Roger Calloway. The hum of the engines, the faint chatter of distant conversations, and the occasional rustle of a flight attendant's movement filled the cabin of Flight 718. Yet, within Roger Calloway's mind, there was only silence. For the first time in decades, he wasn't focused on his next business deal, his stock portfolio, or how much commission he could make off his latest merger. He was thinking about Keanu Reeves. And about himself. Life isn't measured by how much money you have, Roger. It's measured by how you treat others. Keanu's words echoed in his mind, ringing louder than any applause Roger had ever received in a corporate boardroom. He had spent his life worshiping wealth, stepping on those beneath him, and believing money was the measure of success. But Keanu had everything Roger had ever wanted. Yet he didn't care about it. He sat in economy class by choice, not because he had to, but because he wanted to stay connected to people. Roger swallowed hard. It wasn't the first time he had encountered a rich man who claimed money didn't define them, but it was the first time he actually believed it. He let out a slow, shaky breath and glanced at Keanu, who had already returned to his book, as if their conversation hadn't just changed everything. Roger shifted in his seat, suddenly uncomfortable, not from the cramped space, but from the realization that he had spent his entire life missing the point. The flashback. The child he left behind. For the first time in years, Roger's mind drifted to a memory he had buried deep. A moment from his past, one that he had told himself didn't matter. He had been 27 years old, newly promoted to a high-level executive position at his investment firm. It was his first real taste of wealth, of power. His bank account was growing, his car was luxurious, and his suits were custom-tailored. And yet, that was the year his life took a turn. That was the year he left his father behind. His father, a simple mechanic, had spent his entire life working long hours at an auto shop in the Bronx. He never made more than a modest income, but he had never complained. He was the kind of man who gave his neighbors free car repairs when they couldn't afford them, who tipped waitresses extra even when he barely had enough for himself. Roger used to love spending time with him, until he started seeing him as a failure. At 27, with a six-figure salary and a rising career, Roger had visited his father's old garage one last time. He remembered the grease-stained overalls, the smell of gasoline, the flickering light bulb above the workbench. "Dad, you should really retire," Roger had said, looking around the garage with disdain. "I could set you up with something better. You don't have to live like this anymore." His father had smiled, wiped his hands on a rag, and said, "Why would I stop doing what I love?" Roger had laughed. "Because, Dad, you could have so much more." His father had simply patted Roger's shoulder and said, "I already have everything I need." Roger had rolled his eyes. He had left that night, never visiting again. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't understand. Now, sitting in economy class next to Keanu Reeves, he was beginning to understand exactly what his father meant. Money had never mattered to his father, and now Roger realized why. A shift in perspective. He felt a weight settle in his chest. How many people had he looked down on over the years? How many times had he dismissed kindness as weakness? He had spent his entire life chasing status, convinced that luxury made a man valuable. But sitting next to Keanu Reeves, one of the most successful and humble men in the world, he finally saw the truth. Success wasn't about what you had. It was about who you were. And Roger didn't like who he was. His grip tightened around his empty Scotch glass. He took a deep breath and turned to Keanu. "Can I ask you something?" His voice was quieter this time, lacking the arrogance it had before. Keanu looked up from his book, his expression patient. "Of course." Roger hesitated, then asked, "Have you ever been scared of changing?" Keanu set his book aside, folding his hands together thoughtfully. "Change is scary when you think you have something to lose, but real change happens when you realize you have more to gain." Roger exhaled slowly, nodding. Then, for the first time in decades, he did something he never thought he would. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and found a number he had ignored for years. His father's number. His thumb hovered over the call button. Then he pressed it. The phone rang. Once. Twice. Then a familiar, gravelly voice answered. "Roger?" Roger swallowed the lump in his throat. "Hey, Dad. I know it's late, but can we talk?" There was a brief silence. Then his father chuckled softly. "Son, I've been waiting years for this call. Of course we can talk." Roger felt something break inside him, something he hadn't realized had been broken for so long. He had spent his entire life chasing the wrong things. But now he had a chance to make it right. And he wasn't going to waste it. A flight of redemption. Roger Calloway had spent decades believing that money was everything, that wealth equaled worth. But tonight, at 35,000 feet in the air, Beside one of the most humble men he had ever met, his world was being rewritten. As he held the phone to his ear, waiting for his father's voice on the other end, he realized just how much time he had wasted chasing the wrong things. A father's forgiveness. His father's voice, worn but familiar, came through the receiver. "Roger, is that really you?" Roger swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, except in his version, he was calling from the top of a skyscraper, boasting about how far he had come, proving that he had made it. But tonight, for the first time, he wasn't calling to brag. He was calling because he had finally figured out what really mattered. "Yeah, Dad, it's me." A long silence stretched between them. Then his father chuckled softly. "Son, I've been waiting years for this call. Of course we can talk." Roger let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Dad, He hesitated. The words felt heavier than anything he had ever said in a boardroom, heavier than any business deal he had ever closed. "I'm sorry. I should have called sooner." His father was quiet for a moment. Then he sighed. "Son, I never needed an apology. I just needed you to remember where you came from." Roger clenched his jaw, fighting back the emotion threatening to crack through his carefully built walls. He had spent so long running from his past, convincing himself that his father's way of life was lesser, that success meant never looking back. But now, sitting in economy class next to Keanu Reeves, a multi-millionaire who saw no shame in simplicity, he saw just how wrong he had been. "Dad," Roger said, his voice softer now, "I want to see you. I don't care how busy I am. I'll fly to New York after this trip. I need to fix things." His father didn't answer right away, but when he finally did, his voice was warm. "Son, I'll be waiting." Roger ended the call, his hand shaking slightly as he set his phone down. He had spent his entire life measuring success in dollars and status. But in the span of a few hours, sitting beside Keanu Reeves of all people, he had just bought back something that money could never afford: his relationship with his father. Keanu's knowing smile. Roger let out a deep sigh, staring at his phone for a long moment. Then he turned to Keanu, who was still calmly flipping through his book, as if he hadn't just changed a man's life without even trying. Roger exhaled a small laugh. "You knew this was gonna happen, didn't you?" Keanu glanced up, his expression unreadable. Then he smirked. "I had a feeling." Roger shook his head, chuckling to himself. "You're something else, man." Keanu shrugged. "I just believe people have a way of finding their own truth. Sometimes they just need a nudge in the right direction." Roger leaned back in his seat, staring up at the cabin ceiling. For years, he had been obsessed with proving his worth. Yet tonight, a man who had nothing to prove had just taught him everything he had been missing. The unexpected turbulence. Suddenly, the overhead speakers crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing unexpected turbulence. Please fasten your seatbelts." A few passengers murmured as the plane gave a sudden jolt. The cabin lights flickered briefly, and the seatbelt signs blinked on. Roger instinctively gripped his armrests as the plane lurched slightly downward. A baby a few rows back started crying. Some passengers stiffened, glancing around anxiously. Keanu, on the other hand, remained completely unbothered. Roger glanced at him, incredulous. "You don't get nervous." Keanu smirked. "I've been through worse." Roger let out a nervous chuckle. "Yeah, well, I haven't. I don't exactly do turbulence." Keanu closed his book, setting it aside. "You know, Roger, turbulence is just air pressure doing its thing. It's not the fall that gets you. It's how you react to it." Roger gave him a sideways look. "Are you seriously giving me life lessons during turbulence?" Keanu grinned. "Why not? It's all connected." The plane rattled slightly again before settling. The speakers crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are past the rough patch. Thank you for your patience." Roger let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Keanu leaned back. See, you survived. Roger shook his head. All right, I get it. Life lesson noted. Keanu chuckled. Good. A change in perspective. For the first time in his life, Roger Calloway felt lighter. Not because he had more money, not because he had won some big deal, but because for the first time, he had let go of the idea that money was the only thing that mattered. The plane continued smoothly through the night, but inside Roger's heart, a storm had finally settled. He turned to Keanu one last time. You ever think about how weird this is? Roger asked. That you, Keanu Reeves, ended up sitting next to me tonight. Keanu smiled. Nothing is ever really random, Roger. Roger chuckled. You some kind of philosopher too. Keanu smirked. Just someone who's learned to listen. For the first time in his life, Roger wanted to listen to a new man in the making. The steady hum of the airplane engines provided a rhythmic backdrop to the moment of clarity Roger Calloway never knew he needed. For the past few hours, he had undergone a transformation that no business deal, no luxury suite, no high-powered executive meeting could have ever provided. He had spent his entire life chasing wealth, believing that respect, success, and even love were tied to numbers in a bank account. But tonight, somewhere above the clouds, next to one of the most humble and unexpectedly wise men he had ever met, his definition of success was shattered. The unexpected first-class offer. The flight attendant approached their row, her demeanor polite but urgent. Mr. Reeves, she asked, her voice almost nervous. Keanu looked up from his book. Yes. She hesitated for a moment, then smiled. We just had a first-class seat open up. The passenger decided to disembark at our last stopover. Would you like to move up? Roger sat up slightly, his old instincts kicking in. If it had been him, he would have jumped at the chance. He would have bolted out of that cramped economy seat without hesitation. But Keanu simply smiled and shook his head. I'm good here, but thank you. Roger blinked, staring at him like he was insane. The flight attendant was visibly surprised. Are you sure? Keanu nodded. Yeah, I think I'll stay. She hesitated, but after a moment she nodded. All right, just let us know if you change your mind. She walked away, and Roger couldn't hold it in anymore. Are you actually serious right now? He asked, turning to face Keanu fully. Dude, that was a free upgrade to first class. Keanu smiled. I know. Roger let out a disbelieving laugh. So why the hell did you say no? Keanu closed his book and looked at Roger with amusement. Because I like it here. Roger shook his head, laughing incredulously. You like it in economy? Keanu shrugged. It's peaceful. I meet interesting people. And honestly, it reminds me that life isn't about always taking the best seat in the house. Roger stared at him, his mind still trying to grasp the concept. Then Keanu added, besides, if I left, you'd be stuck here alone. And I think you need this conversation more than I need a big seat and free champagne. Roger opened his mouth, then shut it. Because Keanu was right. This flight, this ridiculous, unexpected flight, had somehow given Roger something no amount of money could ever buy. Perspective. And Keanu had just chosen a cramped seat over luxury, just so he could continue guiding Roger toward an awakening he didn't even realize he needed. Roger exhaled a laugh, shaking his head. You're insane, man. Keanu grinned. I get that a lot. The offer that changed everything. For the first time in hours, Roger wasn't thinking about money. He wasn't thinking about the prestige of first class, about his net worth, or about the stock market waiting for him when he landed. He was thinking about who he had been versus who he wanted to be. And the realization hit him like a lightning bolt. He didn't like the man he was. But for the first time in his life, he felt like maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to change. He turned to Keanu, clearing his throat. You ever meet someone and feel like it wasn't an accident? Keanu's smirk widened slightly. Nothing is ever really random, Roger. Roger nodded slowly, then took a deep breath. So, what do I do now? Keanu raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Roger let out a slow breath, rubbing his jaw. I mean, how do I fix this? My whole damn life has been about money. I don't even know who I am without it. I don't know where to start. Keanu leaned back, tapping his fingers on his armrest. He thought for a moment, then spoke. Start by doing something that doesn't benefit you. Roger frowned. What? Keanu smiled. You've spent your whole life making choices based on how they benefit you. Your career, your lifestyle, your relationships, even the way you talk to people. So, start by doing something that has nothing to do with you. No return on investment. No profit. Just pure, selfless action. Roger let the words sink in. He had spent years chasing profit, calculating every move for maximum gain. And Keanu was telling him to do the opposite. All right, Roger said, nodding slowly. I'll do it. Keanu grinned. Good. And I have an idea. Roger arched an eyebrow. Oh yeah? What's that? Keanu tilted his head toward the back of the plane. You see that single mom struggling with her kid back there? Roger turned, spotting a woman a few rows back. She looked exhausted, her toddler squirming in her lap, fidgeting with a worn-out stuffed animal. The baby was restless, whining, and the mother's face was pure exhaustion. Keanu leaned in. Go pay for her seat upgrade to first class. Roger's eyes widened. What? Keanu smirked. You heard me. You wanted to do something selfless. Start right now. Roger hesitated. His old instincts screamed at him. Why should he spend his money on some stranger? But then he heard his father's voice in his head. Son, I never needed an apology. I just needed you to remember where you came from. And suddenly, Roger knew. He stood up, adjusting his suit jacket. All right, let's do this. Keanu watched with a knowing smile as Roger walked toward the flight attendant and whispered something in her ear. A few moments later, she approached the struggling mother. Ma'am, we'd like to offer you a complimentary upgrade to first class, free of charge. The mother's eyes widened. Wait, what? But I didn't. The flight attendant smiled. It's already taken care of. The woman's eyes filled with tears of gratitude as she clutched her toddler closer. Oh my God. Thank you. Thank you so much. Roger watched as the woman was escorted to first class, her face a mixture of shock and joy. And for the first time in his life, Roger felt a kind of satisfaction that money had never given him. Not from profit, not from prestige, but from being a decent human being. He walked back to his seat, sitting down beside Keanu. Keanu simply smirked. Feels different, doesn't it? Roger exhaled a laugh, shaking his head. Yeah, it really does. And as the plane continued its journey across the night sky, Roger Calloway finally understood. True success isn't about what you take. It's about what you give. The final descent. A new beginning. The aircraft's intercom crackled to life, the pilot's calm voice cutting through the gentle hum of the engines. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into New York. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your trays are secured. We'll be landing shortly. The faint stirrings of movement filled the cabin as passengers woke from restless naps, stretched in their seats, or peered out the window to see the city lights glowing beneath them. But Roger Calloway wasn't thinking about the landing. He was thinking about the fact that for the first time in years, he wasn't arriving in a city as the same man who had left. The flight that changed everything. He glanced toward the first-class section, where the single mother he had upgraded was now sitting comfortably, her toddler curled up in her lap, fast asleep. The look of relief and gratitude on her face earlier had shaken something inside him. Something that had been dormant for far too long. It had been so easy for him to change that woman's night. One swipe of his credit card. A single moment of selflessness. And yet, before this flight, he would have never even considered it. Roger exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. How had it taken him this long to understand something so simple? He turned to Keanu, who had just closed his book, stretching his arms slightly. The action was so normal, so unassuming, that it still baffled Roger that he was sitting next to a man worth millions, a Hollywood legend who had chosen to spend 6 hours in economy just to stay connected to reality. "Well," Roger said, his voice quieter than before, "looks like we're almost there." Keanu nodded. "Yeah. How do you feel?" Roger hesitated before responding. How did he feel? The old Roger, the one who had boarded this flight believing he was superior, the one who judged people based on their shoes, their seats, their bank accounts. That man was gone. In his place sat someone he didn't quite recognize yet. Someone he wanted to know more about. He let out a soft chuckle. Like I'd just lost a fight. But somehow, I'm glad I did. Keanu smirked. Sometimes, the best lessons feel like losses at first. Roger exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. You know, Keanu, you could have embarrassed me back there. You could have called me out the second I started acting like a jackass. But you didn't. Keanu tilted his head. Would you have listened? Roger opened his mouth, then paused. He let the thought sit in his mind. No, he wouldn't have. If Keanu had snapped back at him, had rubbed his status in his face, had shown even an ounce of arrogance, Roger would have doubled down on his beliefs, stubborn and proud as ever. Instead, Keanu had let him dig his own hole. And when Roger was deep enough, when he finally realized how wrong he had been, Keanu had simply offered him a hand to climb out. Roger shook his head in disbelief. You're a damn mystery, man. Keanu chuckled. I get that a lot. A decision at 35,000 feet. As the plane continued its descent, Roger pulled out his phone. For years, his entire life had been scheduled down to the second. Every trip, every meeting, every call was designed for one thing: profit. But now he had no idea what came next. And for the first time in his life, he was okay with that. He scrolled through his calendar, finding his upcoming meetings, investor calls, corporate dinners, all things that had once felt so urgent. One by one, he started deleting them. Keanu watched, amused. Busy schedule. Roger let out a dry chuckle. Not anymore. Keanu nodded approvingly. Good choice. Roger hesitated before adding, you know, I've spent my whole life building something. A career. A reputation. But I think it's time I build something that actually matters. Keanu raised an eyebrow. Like what? Roger thought for a long moment. Then, a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Something good. The landing. A new beginning. As the plane finally touched down at JFK International Airport, the wheels screeched against the tarmac, jolting passengers forward slightly. A ripple of movement spread through the cabin as people prepared for disembarkation. Keanu stretched, grabbing his modest backpack from under the seat. Well, Roger, it's been interesting. Roger smirked. Yeah, to say the least. They stood, filing into the aisle as passengers slowly moved toward the exit. As they reached the terminal, Roger turned to Keanu one last time. I don't say this often, Roger admitted, but thanks. Keanu tilted his head. For what? Roger let out a breath. For not laughing at me. For not tearing me apart when I deserved it. For making me realize I don't like the guy I've been. Keanu nodded thoughtfully. Well, lucky for you, Roger. You're not that guy anymore. Roger smiled. Maybe, for the first time, he actually believed that. As Keanu walked off toward baggage claim, disappearing into the sea of people, Roger stood frozen for a moment, watching him go. Then, he pulled out his phone and dialed his father again. Hey, Dad. Yeah, I just landed. No meetings this time. Actually, I was thinking, do you still have that old toolbox in the garage? His father chuckled. Son, I've been waiting years for you to ask that. Roger smiled. For the first time in his life, He was heading towards something that didn't have a dollar sign attached to it, and it felt better than any deal he had ever made.